I'd just like to make the point that we're very fortunate that His Majesty has allowed us to use Buckingham Palace for this event, and I need to say that.
King Charles III just made a decision so consequential, so structurally significant, that constitutional scholars, royal historians, and palace insiders are still processing exactly what it means for the future of the British monarchy. Not since Queen Elizabeth II orchestrated the amendment to the Regency Acts in the final weeks of her life has a single royal decision reshuffled the internal architecture of the Windsor dynasty so completely. And yet, when you trace the full arc of the story, from a quiet girl bumped down a succession line by brothers she never resented, to a woman now holding the keys to Britain's most sensitive governance machinery, you realize this was never an accident. This was a plan. A long, patient, brilliantly executed plan, and the woman at the center of it never once asked for any of it. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, has been formally elevated into a regency-adjacent role that places her in direct contact with what insiders refer to simply as the red box. If that term is unfamiliar to you, understand this. The sovereign's red box is not ceremonial decoration. It is the physical container through which the entire machinery of British governance flows on a daily basis. Inside that box sits classified intelligence reports, draft legislation awaiting royal assent, correspondence from cabinet ministers, briefing papers from the highest levels of state. Every single day, the reigning monarch opens that box and engages with the living, breathing reality of running the United Kingdom. It is the most direct and tangible expression of royal constitutional authority that exists in the British system of government. And King Charles III has just determined that when he is unable to perform those duties himself, the hands that open that box will belong not to Queen Camilla, not to Prince William, but to his sister, Princess Anne. That decision has sent a shockwave through every corridor of the palace, and its implications are only just beginning to unfold. To understand why this matters so profoundly, you have to begin with the pressure that the monarchy has been quietly operating under. Charles has been transparent about his cancer diagnosis to a degree that no previous British monarch would have ever considered. He engaged the public with honesty about his treatment, and the British people responded with a warmth and sympathy that surprised even seasoned royal watchers. But transparency about illness does not resolve the practical governance challenges that illness creates. A monarch undergoing active medical treatment cannot simultaneously manage the full constitutional demands of the role. Something has to give, and the question of who fills that gap is not a minor administrative detail. It is a question that touches the very foundation of how the British state functions in moments of monarchical vulnerability. The most obvious answer, the one that protocol and succession logic would naturally suggest, was Prince William. He is the heir apparent. He is the future king. Every institutional instinct would point toward William as the natural person to absorb greater administrative responsibility while his father focuses on recovery. But Charles, who understands his family and the pressures bearing down on each of them with a clarity that outside observers rarely appreciate, made a different calculation entirely. William is not simply waiting in the wings in comfortable readiness. He is a man carrying an enormous weight of his own. His wife, Catherine, Princess of Wales, has been through her own deeply serious health crisis. He has 3 young children who need a present, engaged, emotionally available father at precisely the moment when their family is navigating significant medical difficulty. He carries the knowledge that the crown will one day be his, that every public appearance, every statement, every decision he makes now is a rehearsal for a role he will carry for the rest of his life. To add to that foundation, the full daily burden of a monarch's constitutional duties would not merely stretch William. It could genuinely damage him, his marriage, his relationship with his children, and ultimately the long-term strength of the very institution he will one day lead. Charles understands that, and he has made clear, through this decision, that he refuses to sacrifice his son's stability on the altar of short-term institutional convenience. So he looked elsewhere. He looked to the one person in the entire royal family who possesses the right combination of experience, credibility, institutional memory, and most critically of all, the complete absence of personal ambition. He looked at Anne. Royal biographer Robert Lacey, whose work on the British monarchy spans decades, and whose access to palace thinking is among the most authoritative of any living writer on the subject, has noted repeatedly that Princess Anne represents a category of royal entirely apart from the modern archetype. She does not cultivate press relationships. She does not manage her image with the careful strategic calculation that characterizes so many modern public figures. What she does, consistently and without variation, is work. The statistics alone are remarkable. For years running, Anne has completed more than 450 official engagements annually, a figure that places her at or near the very top of the working royal family's output, often exceeding the totals of members who receive dramatically more media attention and public recognition. She has done this not during one productive decade, but across an entire half-century of royal service. That is not a record. That is a life's calling. But volume of work alone does not explain why Charles chose her for this particular moment. The deeper reason lies in something more historically layered. Anne is only 2 years younger than Charles. They grew up together through the same political eras, the same constitutional moments, the same historical turning points that shaped the worldview of both. She does not need to be briefed on why certain precedents matter or why particular constitutional sensitivities require delicate handling. She was present when those precedents were established. That kind of institutional memory, living, personal, deeply contextualized memory, is irreplaceable. In a moment of genuine governance transition, it is worth more than any number of formal qualifications or briefing documents. There is also a factor that most observers consistently underweight, and it may be the most important one of all. Anne has zero dynastic ambition. Now, in the context of conventional politics, ambition is generally considered an asset. But in royal politics, ambition in the hands of someone close to the throne has historically been the mechanism through which dynasties have torn themselves apart from the inside. The danger of delegating power to any figure near the throne is always the same danger, that they will use it to advance themselves, build their own faction, or position their allies for greater influence. History is full of such figures, from medieval regents who turned temporary power into permanent usurpation, to more modern examples of royal consorts who allowed their own interests to bleed into the exercise of constitutional authority. Anne is genuinely immune to that entire dynamic. Under the old rules of male preference primogeniture that governed the succession system during her childhood, she was born second, but found herself progressively displaced as her brothers arrived. She was bumped down the line by a system that prioritized gender over birth order, and she simply accepted it. She did not fight it publicly. She did not nurse a visible grievance. She did not spend decades positioning herself for a restoration of perceived status. She turned entirely away from the question of position and directed herself completely toward the question of purpose. That decision, made quietly and without fanfare at some point in her early adult life, is precisely what makes her trustworthy with power now. She cannot become monarch regardless of what happens. There is no incentive for manipulation. When Anne acts, everyone in that room knows she is acting on behalf of the king and only on behalf of the king. In a world of royal politics where every gesture is scrutinized for hidden motive, that quality of transparent, unimpeachable integrity is genuinely extraordinary. What most people miss when they observe Anne's current elevation is that it was not improvised in response to Charles's illness. It is the culmination of something that Queen Elizabeth II began engineering more than 50 years ago. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, whenever the British Commonwealth faced a genuine moment of political difficulty, not ceremonial inconvenience, but real diplomatic tension, real tests of relationships between Britain and its partner nations, Elizabeth did not send the heir. She sent Anne. Not to open buildings and smile for photographers, but to go into the difficult rooms, the tense negotiations, the Commonwealth relationships that required skilled, careful handling where a misread gesture or a clumsy word could cause real damage. Elizabeth was giving her daughter an education that cannot be obtained in any classroom or briefing room. She was training Anne in the actual craft of statecraft at the highest level, deploying her with genuine autonomy and real authority to represent the crown in situations where the stakes were real. Decade after decade, that preparation was quietly accumulating. And then, at the end of her own life, Elizabeth made the structural move that locked everything into place. In late 2022, as she entered the final weeks of her extraordinary reign, Elizabeth orchestrated an amendment to the Regency Acts through Parliament. She added both Princess Anne and Prince Edward to the permanent list of counselors of state, not temporarily, not conditionally, but permanently, for their lifetimes. The existing list of those technically eligible to exercise the monarch's powers in an emergency had developed a serious problem. Prince Harry had relocated to California and removed himself from royal duties entirely. Prince Andrew had become constitutionally untouchable following his devastating public scandals. Had Charles faced a sudden incapacity, and the old list remained unchanged, the people technically available to exercise state power were precisely those whom Charles would never, under any circumstances, actually want handling that authority. Elizabeth fixed it elegantly and irrevocably through parliamentary legislation that could not be challenged, could not be reversed without a new act of Parliament, and was framed so diplomatically that neither Harry nor Andrew could object without appearing to argue against their own established irrelevance. She embedded Anne at the center of the succession of constitutional authority and made it permanent. It was, as a piece of quiet political engineering, brilliant. Then came the coronation. When Charles was crowned at Westminster Abbey in May 2023, he made a choice that should have generated far more commentary than it did. He appointed Anne as his gold stick in waiting, a role with roots reaching back centuries, traditionally reserved for the individual the monarch trusts most completely with their personal safety and protection. There was Anne in full military uniform, riding on horseback directly behind the gold state coach as it carried Charles through the streets of London on the most significant day of his reign, in front of the entire nation, on global television, with every camera in the world trained on that procession. He put his trust on public record. He showed the world without ambiguity and without possibility of misreading who has his back. You cannot tell this story fully without acknowledging the historical layer that makes it considerably more complicated and human than it might otherwise appear. The current tension between Anne's elevation and Camilla's exclusion from genuine constitutional authority is not simply a matter of formal titles and governance logistics. It carries beneath it a deeply personal and somewhat painful history. Go back to the early 1970s, before Camilla was queen consort, before she was even Camilla Parker Bowles. At that time, the man she was in a relationship with, Andrew Parker Bowles, was simultaneously someone to whom Princess Anne had a genuine and passionate romantic connection. They shared a profound love of horses and equestrianism, and by multiple accounts there was something real and authentic between them. The relationship could not proceed toward permanence because Parker Bowles was Catholic, and under the rules governing royal marriages at the time, such a union was simply impermissible. They ended it. Anne eventually married Captain Mark Phillips. Andrew Parker Bowles eventually married Camilla. Then Andrew and Camilla divorced. Charles and Camilla found their way to each other, and the woman who had once been deeply connected to someone Anne had loved became the queen consort. That is a tangled, layered, deeply human history. It is the backdrop against which Camilla now watches Anne being elevated, celebrated, and handed real power, while Camilla herself, who wears the crown, who sits beside the king at every state occasion, who holds every ceremonial marker of the second highest position in the royal household, is kept carefully and deliberately away from the actual machinery of governance. Camilla has the title, Anne has the power. Charles made that choice consciously and with a complete understanding of what it signals. The response from William and Catherine to all of this has itself been telling. Both have been explicitly and visibly supportive of Anne's elevated role. William, in particular, has made his position clear, describing Anne in terms that frame her as an institutional shield, a figure whose reputation for integrity and sustained hard work is so unimpeachable that her presence at the center of the monarchy actually protects everyone around her from the kind of scrutiny that can damage institutions. He has made the argument, in essence, that Anne makes the monarchy safer simply by being prominently part of it. That is a remarkable statement from the future king. Both William and Catherine have also done something subtle but significant at major public events. They have stepped back, redirected attention, and allowed Anne to occupy the foreground. That is an act of active respect, and it communicates clearly that the next generation of the royal family understands its relationship with Anne not as competition, but as alliance. For William personally, the practical dimension of Anne's willingness to carry this administrative burden cannot be overstated. It gives him something he desperately needs right now: space. Space to be present with Catherine during her continued recovery. Space to be a father to George, Charlotte, and Louis at a moment when his children need him fully engaged. Space to prepare for kingship on a timeline that does not destroy him in the process. He understands that Anne's elevation is not a challenge to his future authority. It is a gift to his present life. There was a moment, captured in a BBC documentary about Charles's coronation year, that crystallized for the British public exactly who Anne is and why she deserves every measure of trust being placed in her. The documentary gave viewers an unusually intimate window into the royal family during one of its most vulnerable transitional periods. And Anne did something in that film that members of the royal family almost never do. She was honest. She talked about her mother's final days at Balmoral Castle. She revealed that Queen Elizabeth had actually worried about dying there, not from personal reluctance, but because of the extraordinary logistical complications a monarch's death at Balmoral creates for the state. Even in her final days, Elizabeth was still thinking about the burden she might create for others. Anne's response, as she recounted it, was simple and devastating in its directness. She told her mother to forget about all of that, to be where she wanted to be, to spend her final days in the place where she was happiest, because she had earned that right, absolutely. And then Anne spoke about watching the imperial state crown being lifted from Elizabeth's coffin during the state funeral, and she described feeling something unexpected in that moment, relief. Not because she was not grieving, she clearly was, but because she understood, better than almost anyone alive, what that crown had meant in terms of burden. She understood the weight of duty Elizabeth had carried across 7 decades of sacrifice and service, the subordination of every personal preference to the needs of the institution. That weight had finally ended for her mother. The pressure was finally gone. That raw, unguarded honesty about death, about duty, about what the crown genuinely cost the people who carry it, was something the British public had never quite heard expressed that way by a member of the royal family. It was not theatrical. It was not calculated for effect. It was simply true. And in that truth, it showed people precisely why Anne is the right person for this moment in the monarchy's history. She has always understood what the institution costs. She chose again and again across an entire lifetime to keep paying that cost anyway. Not for recognition, not for position, not for power, but because it was the right thing to do. Charles's decision to censor Anne in this role is ultimately a statement about the kind of monarchy the institution intends to be as it navigates genuinely uncertain terrain. For generations, the palace's strategy for survival was built on projection, on maintaining the image of a family somehow elevated above the struggles of ordinary human life. It was an illusion, obviously, but one the institution invested enormous energy in sustaining. Charles has abandoned that strategy entirely. He went public with his cancer diagnosis. Catherine went public with hers. Rather than concealing the vulnerabilities currently running through the family, the monarchy has chosen to say openly, these are real challenges. These are real people dealing with real circumstances, and here is how we are handling it with honesty and practical wisdom. In that context, placing Anne at the center, acknowledging that governing a nation while managing serious illness requires distribution of responsibility, is not weakness. It is the most honest and ultimately the most sustainable thing a modern monarchy can do. What the public feels when they look at Anne standing ready to open that red box, to engage with the real daily work of the crown, is something the old palace illusion never reliably generated. Genuine trust. Not the passive deference to a distant mythologized institution, but trust in a specific, knowable human being who has spent her entire life earning it quietly, methodically, without ever demanding that anyone notice. That trust is new. That trust is significant, and it may be the single most important thing carrying the British monarchy through everything that is coming next. At the center of all of it stands a woman in her 70s, in military uniform, who never sought the spotlight, never demanded recognition, and never positioned herself for anything. She just kept showing up. She just kept doing the work. She just kept being exactly who